Thanks for joining us. We're excited to bring you some more nonfiction and historical fiction book talks, and we will dive right in. Lauren is going to kick it off for us.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with the Port Chicago 50, and it is a wonderful nonfiction story about World War II. And there was a huge explosion on July 17th, 1944. And at the time, it was the largest man made explosion, and it was on a Navy base at Port Chicago. And that was located in California near San Francisco. And this Port Chicago was a Navy ships that were loaded with bombs and ammunition that they were sending to where they needed to go for the war during the war. And there was mostly Black Navy sailors and white officers that were working at the time. And the Navy sailors were not trained in how to handle this ammunition, and that was very dangerous, as you can imagine. And that is one reason or one thing that caused the explosion that flattened the base. It was so big, it shook homes off the base, like miles and miles away. It killed 320 men total. 202 of those were the Black sailors that were working and loading. And once everything was cleaned up, they were asked to go back to work. And 50 of the sailors refused to go back to work because it was unsafe working conditions. They hadn't changed anything. They still didn't receive any training. And they were considering it mutiny to not go back to work, but they really stuck up for themselves and those working conditions. It was really terrible. As you read through it, you can really feel how awful it was to work there and their treatment. So this is their story looking up to the explosion, and then after the explosion, what happened. The book has amazing pictures and quotes from journals and recordings from during the time. And these men were so brave in their fight for what was right, these working conditions to be changed. It was very unfair. So there's the court trials that you hear about. And these men truly were heroes for sticking up for themselves. So if you're interested in a nonfiction that is a little bit different about World War II, a different side I definitely didn't know about, then I would give the Port Chicago 50 a try.
So the first book I wanted to talk about is a graphic novel. It is called The Boy Who Became a Dragon, and it's about Bruce Lee. So if you are not familiar, he's a very famous martial artist, actor, and his acting kind of grew out of his martial arts skills. So this book kind of follows his life and tells you about his early life as like a kid and how he got into kind of martial arts and became the expert that he was. And then it also kind of shows you some interesting stuff. If you're not familiar with the Chinese zodiac, it has some really cool stuff that has to do with the Chinese zodiac too. So Bruce Lee was born November 27th, 1940. And he was born in the hour and the year of the dragon. And so I recommend, if you don't know the Chinese zodiac stuff, there is some detail in here that'll kind of explain some of it to you. And it's really interesting. There's all sorts of details about what different traits, the types of creatures that line up with the different times of the zodiac have. So people exhibit those traits if they're born as Bruce Lee was, as a dragon. And the artist that did the art for this graphic novel really incorporates some wonderful sort of zodiac inspired art throughout the book, as well as the pictures of the story unfolding. And when he was born, Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco, and he almost immediately moved with his family to Hong Kong. And that's kind of where he grew up. And his dad was an actor, and his dad was also an opera performer. And while Bruce Lee was growing up, the neighborhood that he lived in Hong Kong, there was sort of the Japanese military was occupying Hong Kong at that time. And his dad did some work in film that a lot of people in the neighborhood felt like his dad was kind of betraying them. And so Bruce Lee got bullied a lot when he was growing up. And kind of his first introduction to the idea of martial arts was fighting back against bullies. So this sort of follows him as he actually uses martial arts, starts to learn formal martial arts as a way to kind of channel his anger and kind of deal with some of that. And then when he was 17, he ended up moving back here to the States, and the book follows his journey to becoming the actor that most people are familiar with. So if you're curious about any of those things, this one would be a good choice. Or if you just really love graphic novels, I recommend this one.
Rebel Spy is a book that I highly recommend if you enjoy historical fiction about the American Revolution. It was fascinating. Also, if you like spy stories and intrigue, highly recommend this one. If you weren't familiar, George Washington during the American Revolution had a very specialized ring of spies who did a lot of the work for him and fed him information that ultimately helped that lead to the defeat of the British. And this story follows an agent who we actually don't know the identity of. One of the really fascinating things about some of these spy rings is that we never actually learn. There's no historical records about who these people are. So a lot of that is left up as we've lost it from history. And so that makes for a really good story when you're imagining who these people were. And so this story follows Agent 355, who was a female spy in the Culper spy ring for George Washington. And that's really all we know, is that she was a woman and that she infiltrated and actually had relationships with British officers to feed some of the information. And so this story imagines what her life was like. And it's a story about a girl named Franny who grew up in the Caribbean. And she steals the identity of a young noble girl who lives in New York. This girl is killed in a storm, and Franny is able to assume her identity and kind of live this lie. And throughout the years, she becomes involved in this spy ring. And as the American Revolution gets going, I highly recommend it. There's a ton of action, intrigue. It is so much fun. And it's a really interesting way to imagine how some of the people who were close to Washington during the American Revolution might have lived.
Becoming Muhammad Ali is a really good biography on the story of how Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. And growing up in Kentucky, Cassius was pretty popular, and he hung out with his friends a lot and seemed like a regular kid. He had a younger brother that he hung out with a lot, Rudy. And he didn't really care for school, but it was mostly because he had a difficult time with reading. So you learn all about his upbringing, the neighborhood that he was in. He did experience a lot of racism in his neighborhood and how he kind of was trying to address it and figuring out how to address it. But when his bike was stolen, that really caused Cassius to be determined not to let that happen to him again. And he found comfort in the boxing ring. He really was curious about the power and the strength and the focus and determination it took for those matches. And during the training, it's really awesome to hear how he went from being curious about it, kind of helping out at the gym, to his full-on training and his mentor that he ends up working with through his childhood, starting at the age of 12. I did not realize he was that young when he started his passion. He does have a best friend, Lucius, also known as Lucky, that has a big part in this story as well, which I really liked. He was always by his side through his life, and you really feel that in this story as he does become the legendary Muhammad Ali. So Cassius's part of the story is written in verse, and you really feel that powerful, the way it's written is just super powerful, super strong, kind of punchy feel to it, the way the verse is written, with Kwame Alexander being the author of that part of it. And then it's co-written with James Patterson, who does more of Lucky's part as well. And you really feel the power of both stories working together to show what it was like to become that legendary Muhammad Ali. So if you're interested in boxing and want to know more about getting to that legendary level, it's fantastic, kind of working his way through the neighborhood and with his friends. If you're interested in that side of it, it's also a very powerful story. So it's something for everyone with Becoming Muhammad Ali.
So I recently finished this book. This one is called Meltdown: Earthquake, Tsunami, and Nuclear Disaster in Fukushima, I believe is the full title. It's a long title. This one is a good choice if you are into kind of disaster stories, survival stories. if you have a science interest, this one would be really good. I found it as a super page turner book, and I already knew what happened because this isn't about an event that happened in March of 2011. And I knew what happened, and even so, I still found the book one of those where I was desperately turning pages trying to like read through the details, because the author does this great thing where they give you sort of the play-by-play of all the different events that happened to lead to this disaster. And it started with a massive earthquake. And they talk about plate tectonics. Don't check out at this point and say I do not care about plate tectonics is boring. I promise that they talk about it in a way that's really compelling. And they talk about this, how this earthquake, which was, I believe, a 9.1 magnitude, which is the highest that Japan had ever experienced to date. And the earthquake triggered, so the earthquake was bad enough, caused a lot of destruction, right? But it triggered a tsunami that came in that was a wall of water in places over 100 feet high that then smashed into all over the place. And when that happened, after, so there's the earthquake, there's this giant wave, and there's a nuclear power plant at Fukushima that was damaged during all of this. And then things started to go really wrong at the plant when they lost power. And this is the story, sort of play by play, moment to moment, how that happened. My heads up on this one, it's really compelling and really interesting. There's pictures and there's graphs, and there's a lot of death in this. Roughly 20,000 people died, and there is definitely a description at one point of a class of school children, young school children, who did not survive. So know that going in, but it is fascinating, and there's a lot to be learned about the work that they did at the power plants that saved lots and lots of lives as well. So really, really interesting. I highly recommend this one. And if you aren't familiar with the event, it'll give you lots of good information.
Poisoned Water is a nonfiction book about actually pretty recent events. You may have seen stories in the news about Flint, Michigan. It's a city in Flint that in 2014, the government officials decided to temporarily reroute the city's water source, or parts of the city's water source, from one of the Great Lakes, and instead use the Flint River in Michigan. And what they've discovered over time is it was a really poor choice for a number of reasons, but this book kind of goes into the detail of this crisis. If you're not familiar, you haven't seen the stories, essentially, the people who live in this area in Flint, Michigan, can no longer use the running water that comes into their home, because it has all kinds of toxins and lead and other things in it that makes it undrinkable, but also unusable in any other way. It started disintegrating the pipes in their houses. It gave the people rashes, and some of them got things like Legionnaire's disease and other deadly illnesses. There are actually documented cases of people dying from drinking the water over long term. And so this is just a really fascinating kind of expose case that this author wrote. She went and interviewed people who live there, the people who have started going, because the other really interesting part of this is that the city government tried to deny any sort of wrongdoing. They tried to deny that anything was wrong when the people in the town were having to buy literally like hundreds of cases of water to be able to use for drinking, for showering, for everything, because they can't use the water running through their pipes. And the government claims that nothing is wrong. And even now that they have admitted wrongdoing, all these years later, they still haven't fixed the problem. So if you're wanting to look at something that covers some really recent events and stuff that's still happening, I highly recommend Poisoned Water.
Finish the Fight is a collection of biographies about women who fought for women's rights to vote. It's full of pictures and cartoons and articles about what's happening during this time, things that were posted in newspapers, kind of the conversation that was happening about what these women were doing. It's very powerful, the work that they were doing during this time. And a lot of them were overlooked. A lot of them were names that I had never heard of, and makes you kind of wonder why, because the stuff they were doing was quite amazing. So this really brings to light the other voices that we haven't heard about yet. You might have heard of Susan B. Anthony and all the work that she did, but there's also stories about Mary Eliza Church Terrell, who co-founded the National Association of Colored Women, and Mabel Ping Ha Lee, who at just 16 years old helped lead the biggest parade in history to promote women's rights. There's so many stories and interesting work of what they did on so many different levels. Many were in their communities, doing different things, connecting, helping provide access, so there wasn't barriers to get to the polls when it started to open, all the way to the national levels and doing those bigger parades and the bigger action items that happened. Everything helped in all the different levels, and Finish the Fight really helped show those stepping stones to those actionable items that did help pass women's rights to vote. It is very powerful. It's very interesting to hear about what they did through their lives, and it took 3 generations of women and their male allies to get there. So it's several layers deep of this work that they did. So if you're interested in more of the political side, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of personal stories as well, kind of seeing what the history was then. There's lots of illustrations throughout it as well to kind of paint the picture of what was happening. So you can see the differences among a lot of different nationalities. It is a fantastic book. So let's Finish the Fight.
My Family Divided is a sort of memoir story. And if you are curious about acting, this might be a good choice. Or if you're curious about what it's like when your parents are undocumented immigrants, this might be a good choice. So our narrator, the story's about Diane, and she's telling the story, and she's an actress. She did become an actress in Hollywood. She's been in some different TV shows and things like that. But when she was a kid, her parents immigrated to the United States from Colombia, and she was born here in the United States. So she's an American citizen, but her parents were not American citizens. And growing up, there was kind of this tension where she worried, right, about this, because there was always kind of a chance that something could go wrong and maybe her parents might get arrested or something could happen. And the beginning of the story talks a little bit about that, but it also talks about her growing up. She really was into acting. She liked theater, things like that. It talks about, you know, friends and family. But when she was 14, she came home one day and her parents were gone. And it was very clear, became clear pretty quickly that her parents had been arrested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and they had been deported. They were very quickly sent out of the country, out of America. And she was left here. She's 14, right? And there are supposed to be systems in place where, like through our government, where if a child has their parents deported, there's supposed to be systems in place to get them care because they're a kid. They shouldn't have to survive on their own. And those systems didn't work in this case. Nobody came looking for her from the government. And so she ended up having to kind of move around between friends and other family members she knew and kind of take care of herself starting at 14. And it was really hard, like as you could imagine, scary and hard and frustrating. And she talks about it, and she talks about kind of how she made do and how she got into college, what she did when she was college aged, and then how she became an actress. It's a really interesting story. And my content warnings for this one is that she dealt with a lot of this stuff, and she ended up dealing with depression, mental illness, and she also, there's some discussion of self-harm that she went through while she was kind of trying to figure this out and cope with those types of things. So know that that's in there, but overall, it's a really interesting story, and it's got a lot of those details if you like kind of day-to-day, everyday life type stories. This one would be a good choice.
They Called Us Enemy is a graphic memoir, so it's written in graphic novel format by George Takei. If you're not familiar with who George Takei is, he is a pretty famous actor who's most well known for playing Sulu on the original Star Trek series. So if you're a Star Trek fan, you would recognize him. But this is the story of his younger life. When he was 4 years old, World War II, the United States had just entered World War II. And in the early part of 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued an executive order that created the Japanese internment camps in the United States. And essentially within a matter of days and weeks, every Japanese citizen in the United States, as well as all Japanese immigrants, were rounded up and taken to these camps. And they were left there for the duration of the war. And these were not really nice places to live. They were not well planned out. Some of them, when they got there, didn't even have beds or anything else for them to stay in. And so this is his experience. He shares what it was like to be a little boy, he and his baby brother, and eventually had a baby sister with his parents living in these camps. And they lived in multiple internment camps throughout the war. They were transferred from one in California to Arkansas, and then later to another in Utah towards the end of the war. And he talks about what that was like, but also it kind of jumps back and forth to his present day and what his experience is like. And he has a pretty complicated relationship with FDR, as you might imagine. FDR is often revered as one of the greatest presidents in the United States. He was elected more times than any other president, served 4 terms. And there were some things that he did that were not so great, especially for Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans in the United States. And so this is a really fascinating look inside what it was like to grow up in these internment camps and what that experience is like. If you're looking to learn more about that part of World War II, I highly recommend it. That is all of the books that we have for you today. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We hope that you find a few that you'll enjoy, and we also hope that you'll have an awesome summer. See you later.